Okay, so in the initial part of your presentation, you mentioned there was a big disconnect in Australia. Can you flesh that out a bit more for us?
The disconnect that I mentioned in my speech earlier, it was really a sense that, you know, we view Asia as an opportunity of growth, and China's growth has slowed down a bit, but nevertheless Asia's still growing at 5% plus and China's growing at 7.5%. And we think that urbanisation story is a huge story for Asia, in particular. 650 million people entering the middle class, something like 11 trillion of infrastructure investment required over the next 10 to 20 years to build out all of that urbanisation. And within that story, Australia plays a huge part. It's geographically located to benefit from that story. From a resource perspective, it has advantages because of its proximity, and that story is well known. So that's a positive for Australia, and the other positive is that urbanisation creates wealth, and that wealth is going to demand beyond energy, food. And Australia is an agricultural exporter, of course. China in particular turned to importing food because of its growing population and growing demands. So Australia can position itself in a number of sectors to take advantage of this growth, not just mining, of course. We're a services-based economy, so in areas of education, for instance, we're now attracting 70% of our foreign students are now coming from China. Tourism numbers in particular are growing rapidly from China. So as we embrace and engage the growth of these other sectors in the economy and focus on them, then there's huge opportunities for Australia. So when you think about that long-term optimism, at the moment Australia's sentiment in the business community and in the population generally, through well-published surveys, is quite negative. You know, there is a concern about the high dollar. There was concern about the certainty of policy around tax. There's been a number of areas which the press widely publish, and so it's strange to come back and hear about so much negativity when the rest of the world's view on Australia is quite positive.
Okay, sure. And so you're quite positive on China, and you mentioned, can you reiterate why and what your forecast growth rate is there?
Our view on China is reasonably positive. We still think that our Chinese economists are forecasting growth of 7.5%, and over the medium term, a growth path of 7 to 9%. So sure, you know, not the 10 to 12% that we saw at the boom in China, but a more sustainable, if you like, position of somewhere between 7 and 9. So the fundamentals that support that are increasing focus on the consumption side of the Chinese economy. So the growing wealth of China's population is part of the consumption story. The urbanisation of China requires huge infrastructure commitment around railways and roads and energy, and the higher incomes that we're seeing in China are going to create that wealth that sees the extra consumption.
Sure, and you mentioned that in the next 10 years, the Chinese policymakers will be focusing on Australia. What will that involve?
Well, China has been interested in Australia over the last decade as they expand outside of China and look for investment opportunities. That trend has really been growing from a small base to a much larger base. So the trade base with Australia has gone up by 10 times, but it started a decade ago or more. But really, we've seen an acceleration in this, and China's view of Australia as a market within Asia to do business with is increasing all of the time. And the pace at which China want to focus on outbound investment is increasing, and Australia is one of the countries that China views as a good destination for that outbound investment.
Sure, you mentioned a specific figure though that China's looking to allocate. 80 billion FDI?
I think it's about 77 billion of FDI intentions from China. And in the last 5 years or so, Australia's been one of the biggest beneficiaries of foreign direct investment alongside the US. And so of that 77, you know, a proportion is going to be looking at Australia as a good place, a good destination.
Okay, and just wanted to focus more on the commodities boom. So you mentioned there's a new phase to go, but we're hearing all this talk in the media that it's over, it's finished.
The infrastructure spending, anticipating demand in different areas of gas and coal and in other areas, has been a huge boom, and the terms of trade associated with high commodity prices has provided the expectations of infrastructure planning and investment. Commodity prices have now come down, and Australia's cost base has become relatively high as the boom has forced prices up for labour and infrastructure building in general. So that part of the boom has most definitely slowed very, very significantly, and there's been some very well publicised cancelling of infrastructure projects. My point in the speech that I made was that infrastructure is still a couple of years to be completed, the stuff that is currently being built. As the exports come on stream as a result of the infrastructure spending, then that's the next part of the benefit for the Australian economy. So the value of those exports is something that's yet to come, and that will be the next phase of this current mining boom.
Sure. So I just want to drill down on that a bit more. So we've had talk that the US is going to, in the next decade, become a net fuel exporter and crowd out other markets. It's going to be, we're not going to be able to sell stuff for a good enough price to make it worth it. What's your view on that? That the US is going to crowd out other competitors?
Well, the US may well become an exporter, and Australia may well take the same position. So it's a question of how those industries develop. The US industry around gas is probably a bit ahead of Australia, but Australia is going through a current process of thinking about regulation which would support the huge gas reserves that we have in Australia. And I guess one of the benefits we have is our proximity. So if we develop the capability around those exports, as has the Gorgon gas infrastructure in exporting gas into Japan, as an example, then we have a huge advantage actually in this region for exporting to Asia. But there's always going to be competition.
Okay, sure. And you just talked about there's certain barriers that policymakers here can clear so that we can capitalise the next boom. What is that?
I don't know.
Okay.
But that'll be.
Yeah. So particularly for agriculture.
It would be good to see. In particular agriculture, there hasn't historically been a well-targeted framework around developing the industry with the eye to an Asian expansion. Our agricultural industry has always been the beneficiary of foreign investment from Britain, from the US, but it is somewhat a fragmented industry, and in many cases the scale that you would need to support the growth in consumption in Asia is probably not there across the industry. So we'd like to see some policies around the private sector and the public sector to develop strategies around supporting Asian growth and the increase in access to those Asian markets. And that's a public and a private debate, and it's a question of being focused on the long term.
Okay. All right, Tony. All right. Thank you so much for your time. That's great.
Pleasure.